Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are just connecting our streaming feeds and we will get started in just a moment. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we are all connected, so take it away, Heidi.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Heidi Daniel, President and CEO of the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's special event. We are thrilled to be welcoming Toni Tipton-Martin to the Pratt Test Kitchen. Of course, we are hoping to be able to do more of these, not just virtually, but in person. And I want to thank our donors who make the free programs like this, whether virtual or in person, possible for the Pratt Library. The Pratt Test Kitchen is a new series of programming at the library that celebrates the diversity and creativity of Baltimore's culinary scene. We have a wide range of events for all ages. Take and make recipe boxes for kids, healthy little chefs cooking demonstrations, interviews with local chefs about the intersection of food and social justice, and then events like tonight, when we are lucky enough to welcome high-profile culinary creators. Toni Tipton-Martin is focused on building a healthier community through her books and work as a food and nutrition journalist. She recently received her 7th Julia Child Award. She's a cookbook author, a culinary historian, and the editor-in-chief of Cook's Country magazine. Toni Tipton-Martin is a James Beard Book Award winner, a recipient of the International Association of Culinary Professional Trailblazer Award, and its Book of the Year Award. She recently started the Toni Tipton-Martin Foundation to support future generations of women in food. And tonight, she's in conversation with the owner of the Urban Oyster, of which I'm a fan, Jasmine Norton. It is my pleasure to welcome Toni Tipton-Martin and Jasmine Norton to the Pratt stage.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Toni, it is such a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Such an honor. I'm so excited. I'm anxious to get right into it, and I know our viewers are as well. So I want to go all the way back to the beginning. So I'm interested in knowing, and all of us, I'm sure, are like, how did you get started cooking?
Well, thanks for being here with me. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to meet you as well. I want to make sure we talk about oysters and women and men too before the night is over. But I am from Los Angeles, and I was a student, a journalism school student, and I had a professor who suggested that I might be able to get into the newsroom faster if I would go through the features section of the paper. And back then, it was not quite the women's page, but it was close. And food was a way that you could get into the paper without having to have years and years of experience. And so I decided to go and work at a little weekly newspaper near my home, and that gave me a jump start on the career. They asked me to write about food and recipes. I had no idea what I was doing, but they did teach me the mechanics of how to read a recipe. And I just decided that if I was going to do it, I might as well do it right. And so I started attending events. I started thinking up stories that I could do that were in my area of interest. So one of my first interviews was with Wally Amos, Famous Amos Cookies.
Wow.
And of course, I met Julia Child during that time as well.
That's amazing. You know what's so interesting is our paths have crossed quite a bit. I have my broadcast journalism degree, and I didn't quite go, as far as you have. I worked for an audiovisual corporation before I started my business. So it's so interesting that, we have similar journeys, to a degree. So I would say, what would you define your cooking style as?
What an interesting question. My husband and my children would say that I am a kind of a spontaneous cook. I like to read recipes to get a frame of reference because I'm not classically trained. So that's where our paths, I'm sure, part. In that I do need the basics. I need some bumper guards,
Mhm.
to help me get my inspiration, and then I wind up off on a tangent. Right? It's just whatever I have in the kitchen at the time.
Yes, I can totally identify with that. It wasn't until I actually had to kind of pass the baton with my staff that I actually started writing recipes. I am very much like that person who just does it. You know what I mean? And I know that that is not helpful to my staff, but I just do it. But so, what inspired you to write Jubilee?
Yes, so I started this cookbook collection, and I realized pretty early on that it was telling a story that America had not heard about African American cooks and African American food. But we quickly realized that it was too much information for one book to contain. So the publisher was great in helping me understand that just because you think you got this one opportunity, you got to cram it all in there. They were like, take a break, do the first book, get that information out there, and then follow it up with the recipe book. And so Jubilee is a recipe collection that reflects recipes from more than 200 years of Black cooking as viewed through my recipe collection, my cookbook collection.
Awesome. And so I had a chance to, and I have it sitting right here, by the way. I had a chance to look
Did you
through.
get it at Target?
I absolutely did. um, that's the closest place, that is near to me in the city to get it. But so I certainly did. But the thing that stood out to me with Jubilee was, your thinking behind the name Jubilee. And for those who may not have had a chance to grab your book or even read the intro, can you tell us, or elaborate a bit on the connection to the biblical, space that Jubilee references?
Yeah, that is such a wonderful. The title is a concentration of so many different aspects of the African American experience, um, and we are people of faith mostly. And the term Jubilee is an expression of freedom that in the 50th year following servitude, that when people are set free, they will return to their land and find their identities, unyoked from their captors. And so it's a biblical term, but it also was adopted by the formerly enslaved folks who on the 50th year celebrated Jubilee. And the goal for me in using that terminology was to say that at the beginning of my work, when you initially encounter me and the project, the Jemima Code and Jubilee, we'll all come to this content with different perspectives. We've all had different experiences, and we have different thoughts. But my hope is that at the end, when you finish cooking your way through, um, you'll be free. We are all free. We're free from the limitations, the barriers set up um, by others to divide us as a culture, as a community. But young people in particular are free now to look forward and think about who they want to be in the food world, and what opportunities they want to carve for themselves that are not yoked to stereotypes and the limited boundaries that were initially set for African Americans in food.
Yes, that's amazing, and I'm so glad you pointed that out, because the next question I wanted to ask you is, how do you feel that your identity shows up in your food?
Well, there's always that soul part. Um, Cooking with the soul is not mindless, innate, and it's not a natural skill. When I use the term soul, what I mean is that it is cooking with your sensors. It means being involved and engaged with your food. And that's what I think African Americans over the generations who were trying to explain what soul food is had such a hard time. They kept talking about how it was vibration and they felt it, and like all of these ethereal explanations that didn't really help someone trying to translate that recipe into a book or a restaurant menu, right? And what they were saying is that what we said at the beginning, like you start with a foundation, but then through your contact with the food, you develop an appreciation for it. You have to smell it. You have to taste it. You have to know how sweet honey is compared to maple syrup, compared to granulated sugar. You just don't blindly put those things in your food. And so you develop a palate. You develop an appreciation for the way certain flavors go together. It looks on the outside like you're cooking with a kind of voodoo magic, right? Because you're not measuring. But I'm fond of saying that when the ancestors would sprinkle in that amount of salt or spice into their dishes, they could eyeball how much it was. It wasn't because they just knew magically. It was because they were practiced and they had been apprentices and they were learned people. They were knowledgeable and they were proficient in their skill. And that's what I have hoped my work would reveal, is the intellect as well as the sensorial parts of cooking, because they go together. It's a skill and it's an art.
That's awesome. And so in your book, you mentioned that you felt like that America has what you described as pigeonholed the African American food culture into the soul food cuisine. Like, what, your definition of soul food, in my opinion, I can obviously identify with, and it makes total sense to me. Like, to America, what have they pigeonholed that term or that phrase to be in the African American food culture for us?
Yeah, so I want to make sure that I'm crystal clear for new audiences to this work, that people understand I don't have any dismerit. I do not intend to disparage African soul food. What I want to make clear is that this narrow definition that has been assigned to our cooking as soul food is too narrow. So soul food is a thing. I want to be crystal clear about that. And it's a thing that we should respect, we should appreciate and honor, because it descends from the survival cooking of the plantation cabin and the people who made do and survived with very limited resources under barbaric circumstances, right? So we want to honor them for the skill that it took to make something out of nothing, and then to carry that with them generationally.
Absolutely.
But what we don't want to do is believe any longer that that's the total African American experience. And so what Jubilee does is takes a second look at the plantation experience first and helps us start there and look forward at what it meant to be a professional cook. Right? We don't know what our favorite Food Network stars cook at home with their families. We honor and celebrate them for the food they prepare at work. But when it came to African Americans, we only wanted to talk about the cabin and the poverty and the soul food and so on. We did not ever want to talk about people being classically trained, people studying in France, people who ran their own businesses and had entrepreneur skills. And so what Jubilee does is helps us understand that there are two sides to the African American food experience. One is through the professionals, and the second is through the home cook.
Absolutely, and I totally agree with that. When you were mentioning your distinction between the two different variations of soul food, and in your opinion, I instantly thought about, I think it's that movie, The Butler.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how, African American chefs were cooking for presidents, even back then. And I know that the cuisine was not restricted or, only subjected to, soul food. These people were, like you mentioned, professionally trained, creating exquisite, cuisine and food for these presidents, obviously. And so when you were speaking just now, it just made me think of that movie. And, like I said, African American chefs that worked for, these sort of elitists, so to speak. And obviously they had an extensive, level of creativity, but as well as skill. And so honestly, that was one of the reasons that I created the Urban Oyster. I felt like that there was no presence, or a strong presence rather, for the African American, chef community, that, or the representation wasn't as strong as I felt like it should be. And I feel like a little bit there's some saturation as it pertains to the way that most people perceive soul food to be. So my next question for you is, how do you feel Black culture and American food intersect?
I'm so distracted by what you were saying that I want to table that question for just a second, because I cannot focus without saying how incredible it is that you have reclaimed that territory, because one of the important professional skills in our ancestry was oystering.
Absolutely.
And we have a high there are many records associated with important oyster house operators, not only in Baltimore, but also in Philadelphia. In this corridor between here and Rhode Island, people created generational wealth with the oyster.
Absolutely.
And also set people free by operating underground railroad businesses there. So I think it's so cool that you are aware that you've got to write your recipes down, because that's how you train the next generation, right?
Yeah.
And you could apprentice them all and just stand there with them, as our ancestors did in their oyster shops or their grog shops or their confectionery businesses in the 18th century. They translated and transferred their knowledge person to person, right? And we call that apprenticing in culinary school. But somehow when we were talking about African Americans, we dismissed that language and didn't call it that. It is true that we were communicating orally and speaking in the oral tradition, and all of those are words that have been used to avoid explaining that Black folks were teaching each other their skills one-on-one. And so to answer the question as you asked it, I think that the food and the people are intertwined. They go together. You can't separate them. Our ancestors, when your auntie says, I'm going to put on a pot of beans, she's making stock.
Mm-hmm.
And it's time for us to give credit for that. And not try to disentangle like there's Blackness somewhere in that. It's cooking skill, and it's just part of who we are, and it's an experience that we've had at all levels, whether at all economic levels, at all regional levels. The foods that we have created are based on our Black experience.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said about auntie in the stock, I feel like sometimes, food can kind of, I don't know, have its trends like fashion in a way. And it's like, it goes back and forth, like what is a delicacy and what isn't, and what is, considered like, like a food that is, more of a cost efficient. Like when I think of like, chicharrones, like that's making a big comeback, or ramen, or, things of that nature, or when lobster was not necessarily considered a delicacy, or even oysters for that matter.
Right.
And I just think that it's so interesting the way it goes back and forth, like I said, almost like, fashion trends. But
So I have a funny story. I was testing one of the recipes that's in an upcoming issue of our magazine, Cook's Country, and it's for meatballs with ras el hanout or something like that. And I just made it blindly, right? The way that the instructions said. And I got about a third of the way into the recipe, and I was thinking, this is very familiar to me. This is a recipe that I used to make all the time with chicken. It was called chicken couscous. I
mhm,
took it from a famous white male chef's cookbook. He didn't call it ras el hanout or harissa, but he broke down and gave all the spices that were in the ras el hanout.
mhm,
Right. So the closest we got to that being a cultural recipe was to say that it was served over this grain couscous.
mhm,
But there was a time when the trend was not to be focused on identifying that list of 7 spices is called ras el hanout, right? But today we do that in
mhm.
reference and respect and deference to cultural foodways. And so I just thought it was really interesting that there was the identical dish made with lamb, but today we call out where it came from. So I'm happy that those transitions are starting to happen.
Absolutely. And I think that's amazing. And I think you are obviously, one of those people to for us to, credit for that. And I thank you for, creating a voice or a stronger and louder voice, for us to, as African Americans being valued in the culinary space. Um, so, what would you say is the biggest misconception about African American food culture?
Oh, I think the biggest misperception is that it is limited to soul food and that it is prepared instinct by instinct. African Americans have been trained to be good cooks, just like everyone else, and there are plenty of us that are terrible cooks because we didn't come under the tutelage of a great cook. And so that's a really important thing to understand is that we're not all great cooks. As I said, I am a good cook. I'm a competent cook. I'm a trained cook, right? So I have learned. I have a vast um, recollection of recipes in my head so that like I said I could remember just from a few of the ingredients and getting third of the way into a recipe that this is familiar to me, something I've experienced before. um, but that's the misperception, is this understanding that we can maintain our cultural identity, but we're free to be creative with other ingredients and other cultural techniques and fuse those together. That's the basis of American cooking anyway. American cooking, if we're going to go all the way back to what is America, that would be Native American cooking, right? And so what we have are colonists who came with their food ways. They intersected with the natives and the food stuffs that were found here. And then we had African hands that were preparing it with memories from the way they prepared dishes in the motherland. And all of those things as a confluence of events come together and give us American food. But for a long time, the Africanness in that um, story was marginalized or minimized.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think it's so interesting, that when you mention it, and I think it should be so much more simpler than having to actually have to say, like, we are more than soul food. Um, I think it's so interesting because, like, even we can sometimes be, judgmental of that as well. Like, if someone throws up, a taco, joint, or, an Asian restaurant, people are even, African Americans are like, what are you doing? Like, it's just like, we can cook anything just like every other chef. You know what I mean? If you're classically trained, or even if you're just a good chef, self-taught chef like myself, and you as well, Toni. Why can't we, cross into other cuisines like some others cross into ours? You know what I mean? Like, I think of Yardbird, you know what I mean? They're cooking chicken and mac and cheese and greens. Like, so why can't we cross over into those, in those spaces as well?
Well, we do have some, there's some historical, I don't know if this is a word, but propagandizing that has happened to us as a people, right? And so we can be hypercritical and say, well, that's not the way my mama makes the greens, right? And you didn't, and what it's important for us to realize, you didn't go to the restaurant looking for your mother's greens. No one has said that. So you're talking about the simple things that need to be said. How about that? You went to a restaurant for a different experience than the one you can get at home. Does that mean that you still might order the same kind of food? Sure. You might order macaroni and cheese and greens and fried chicken that you could get at home. And it becomes important to not put the chef in a box and criticize them and say this is inauthentic or it's too expensive, right? Because you'll walk right down the street and pay the tattooed guy for that same meal, $15 a plate, and then want us to serve it for $6. So we have some maturing to do as it relates to African American food, and I want to just use that as a segue back to your previous kind words and congratulations on what I've achieved, to say thank you for that, but also to point out that this work has never been about me. This work was intended to set us all free, as I said, from the labels, and to give back the dignity to our people so that we can appreciate what they did. It's impossible for us to know how to go into a restaurant and treat your food with respect if we aren't aware that it's not new. You're not just jumping through some trendy hoop and trying to sell, $30 dinners. You're actually throwing back to your ancestry, where we had oystermen in our community, and we had trained chefs, and we had mixologists, and we had restaurant owners, and we had cooking school owners. Like, that was the best news for me, to realize that there were cooking school teachers, not just at HBCUs, but women who had their own businesses, right? And so it opens up our eyes to the possibilities for our kids, to not think that the opportunities for them are only in athletics and being, musicians, that there are other avenues that our ancestors used to obtain their independence and their freedom. And it's time that we get our kids thinking that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. So throughout your journey, with pursuing, the idea of, giving us a voice, or, contributing to the freedom of, of our people as it pertains to, the culinary world, what would you say are some challenges that you faced, in your journey? Did everyone agree with what you were doing? Was everyone on board? Every publisher you went to, or every news channel, or, magazine channel, was everyone on board, or did you get any type of resistance?
Oh, I had plenty of resistance. I experienced the same obstacles that I'm describing when I was initially in the newsroom, and the questions about my ability to write about anything other than African American food, even though I was a trained journalist who learned to write with objectivity and to research a topic and to find sources to validate whatever it is that I was observing. Fast forward, when I found this content and had it in a place where I thought it could be a book. The publishing industry was not interested in supporting me as the person to deliver this story. They thought, I think, that it was better delivered by an academic, a scholar. And so my material was co-opted from me in the same way that our ancestors' recipes were co-opted from them. And I've had ideas for TV concepts that people kind of disappear when I present them with a pitch deck, and then lo and behold, a show appears. But I'm a woman of faith, and I have been so incredibly blessed through this content. Young people like you that are um, encouraged, uplifted, optimistic. That other work doesn't do that, right? And so the message is the message. Sure, someone else delivered it, and I had to get over that, and it was hard. I'm not gonna, deny that. And I did hurt for a long time as I watched other people ascend with my material. But I also had the ancestors to gird me and to realize that they had watched that too, that their recipes were taken from them and published in white women's books, or they weren't ever recognized for having had a television show in New Orleans. We had a Black woman named Lena Richard who had a cooking show before Julia Child did, and we were only hearing about her through the Jemima Code. So that book, the Jemima Code, has been described as the zeitgeist by some in your generation, which I think is such a cool word, to say that I don't always have to be out in the front. Like I know that I created that concept and brought it forward, but it's really about the authors. And I'll tell you this: the first time I knew that it was working, there was a bunch of African American male chefs that were doing events, and they would send me social media or text pictures, I don't remember, but the book, the Jemima Code, would be sitting on the table while they were prepping or else when they were serving. But their point to me was the ancestors are here with us. And I get choked up about that because those other projects, they just didn't do that.
Yeah. I totally understand that. And I want to tell you that you are even an inspiration to people who aren't, chefs or, in the necessarily directly in the food industry. I have a friend who he is in charge of diversity and inclusion at a local hotel here at Hotel Revival. And he has like a brand ambassador partnership with Martell. And he cooked some recipes from your recent cookbook, Jubilee. And, I have so many friends who, are in the same age group as me, whether they work in the industry or not. They are extremely inspired by your journey, the purpose of your books, as well as your recipes. So I'm so stoked right now to be, on this show with you. And I know a lot of them are watching because they were excited for this opportunity.
Well, if I could, so the cool thing about the recipes is, since I'm not a trained chef, I wanted the recipes to be ordinary. So I did not want them to be chefy. I wanted them to be a little bit ambiguous and cause some confusion. Like, well, how is this Southern? Isn't it Black? Is it white? Is it like, I wanted people asking all those kind of questions. Because that's how you dig in deeper, right? What I wanted everybody to do is to be like, you went into that Black restaurant and say, well, this ain't the way my mama makes pound cake. Okay, so make it that way. What I gave you is the framework for how to do it.
Right.
What are the basics that need to be there? And Jubilee shows you the historical path that a recipe took to get on our menus or to stay on our menus. So how did it start in 1827 and still be published today in contemporary cookbooks? And then at the end, what I want you to do is say where you got it, right? I want you to give that attribution that says, I was inspired to make this, not necessarily by Toni Tipton-Martin, but by by her adaptation from B. Smith, right? And the New York Times has done a really good job of that. They have made sure that every time they rant and rave about those pork chops, that they mention the original source, which means a lot.
Right, right. And I'll be honest, when I saw the guacamole recipe, I was like, okay. And then I started, then I read on and, you know, read the spices and the chips that you incorporated with it. And I was like, okay, I see. And so what it basically translated to me was like a fusion, you know, of things that, you know, we wouldn't typically expect, you know, for people in our culture to obviously have in a cookbook like this, but also, you know, how you can like merge these cultures together.
Which they did, right? So as soon as African Americans were set free, then they're in communities where they're interacting with people of other cultures. So, and particularly in New York, you would have Puerto Ricans and, you know, Black people side by side. If you're moving west, you're having more of that Southwestern influence. So it is natural that the guacamole goes on the menu, and then you realize that it's a fruit that we had that's tropical. So it's part of island experience, and ultimately, then I was really excited to find it in West Africa.
That's awesome. So what is your go-to recipe in the Jubilee book?
Melinda Russell's lemon tea cake.
That sounds amazing. I may
It's
have
amazing. I love her story. I'm sitting under this heat lamp. It's melting me. Sorry.
It's hot anyway, so the houses trying to get adjusted to the summer outside, and
yeah, it's crazy. So that cake, I love Melinda Russell's story. Melinda Russell was a free woman of color. She published her book in 1866.
wow.
There's only one known copy of the book at the University of Michigan. Somebody sent it to them. It was found in a collection from a magazine editor in California. It's so fragile that nobody could touch it, but they were able to digitize it. And Melinda tells us quite a bit about herself in her little intro. And she explains that she's a single mother with a challenged child. She's trying to get home, so she's got this book in order to move back to her community. She tells us that she apprenticed under a Black cook in Virginia, so she studied in the style of the Virginia housewife, which was a well-respected and known cookbook. And lastly, she owned her own business. She owned a bakery and a boarding house. So her story is so compelling to me and so inspirational to young women who I turn to her and I say, I know your life can be hard, right? I know that single motherhood thing, but you weren't living in a time of enslavement. And this woman was also robbed. So every time she got enough money, she was then, was taken from her. And so here's this baker, and she makes this cake that, lo and behold, I recognized in a book by Ina Garten, The Barefoot Contessa. And so they're making the same cake. And it is just decadent. It is basically a pound cake, but in our tradition, we use a little mace for the seasoning in pound cake classically. And this is a lemon pound cake. So it's packed with lemon juice and the grated lemon zest from the outside of the lemon. But what is really unique about it is that when you take it out of the oven, you poke holes all over the surface of it and pour on a warm lemon and sugar syrup that penetrates the crumb of the cake. And so now you not only do you have this decadent, this wonderful crumb in the cake, but you also have little pockets of sweet tart lemon. It's divine.
That is amazing. And I'm salivating. That sounds so good. Pound cake is like one of my favorite cakes. And just really quick, because we have some questions already for you, Toni. But we used to sell a lemon pound cake. And it's so crazy how things come full circle. And I didn't even realize it until this moment, in all transparency. But Amanda Mack used to make, before Crust by Mac opened, she used to make that lemon pound cake for us at the Urban Oyster.
Oh, really?
Yes, she used to make a lemon pound cake with a glaze on top, and it was phenomenal. So it's just so crazy how that comes full circle. So, like I said, I'm salivating.
Oh, that is wild. I'm going to ask her about it and see, could you make that again?
Right. Now, I do want to ask you one really quick question before we go into the Q&A, because I just feel like I want to close it off before jumping into the Q&A. But just really quickly, what advice would you give to young Black chefs? Not just women chefs, not just male chefs, but just young Black chefs. What is some advice you would give them?
I would encourage them to get the basics, understand the technique, and get firm in their training, and then practice so that they can then become creative. I think sometimes we go straight to the creative without the fundamentals, and then it makes it hard for restaurant reviewers or for the customers to kind of understand where you're going with this dish. But it can be really exciting to have something that's a comparison, right? And so I just think that understanding the fundamentals is really important. I don't know that I'm an advocate for Culinary Academy. It's a very expensive education, and from what I hear from all of you, it hardly, pays out. So, but to apprentice under someone really knowledgeable, who can get you trained. That's the goal of my nonprofit. Ultimately, is to help aspiring young people get into the industry, primarily as writers, because chefing is not my thing, but journalism is. And that may mean working really closely with established authors like myself. Don't be surprised when people ask you to do jobs that you think are beneath you, or that you already know how to do that, right? Someone is trying to teach you how to refine that skill or that art. And I think that sometimes we can just get in our own way. So get the knowledge, practice it, and then use that to be creative and think outside the box.
Awesome. Thank you. That was an amazing response. All right. So we have our first question here, and it says, did you ever use the Pratt's recipe archives in your search or collecting? Did you use any specific archives?
So I've only been in Baltimore for 2 years, and most of my collecting and search had already been completed by then. I will say that in the 2 years that I've been here, my books have been in storage. So I use Pratt quite a bit, actually, even though I'm getting copies of the books that I already have. I don't speak I take my own of the advice I just gave, right? That I refer back to an original source, to an original source when I'm speaking. So I need those books, and so I go back to the library to get them.
Okay. All right. So the next question we have is, it may be a little silly, but do you have a favorite food or dish?
I love sweets. I have a terrible sweet tooth, and chocolate chip cookies are my favorite. And we're actually doing a little filming tomorrow of me making some chocolate chip cookies here in Boston on the Cook's Country set.
That's believable, because when you were describing that pound cake, you you were describing it, and you dissected it and put it back together. So I believe you do have a sweet.
Well, my mother is a vegetarian pescatarian, and I grew up in an urban garden in LA, and so our backyard was basically all fruit and vegetable trees and plants, and so my mother really instilled that healthy lifestyle in us early. But she also had a sweet tooth. So we eat a lot of vegetables, a ton of salad, and then there's got to be a little bite of something sweet after.
Yeah,
But the meat thing, I like a good hamburger bite or two,
Yeah.
but I cannot finish the whole thing.
Yeah.
I like seafood.
I love seafood. All right. So the next question we have is: are there any recipes from Jubilee that you make over and over?
Yeah, the cover photograph is of barbecue shrimp. And the story that goes with that recipe, which has also been reprinted a lot in the years since Jubilee's been out, is that we made it on Christmas Eve the first time when I was testing it. And the family just stood around the stove and ran crusty French bread around in the pan. We couldn't even get it to the table. It was that delicious. And so we love that recipe.
Yeah, I can only imagine what the aroma was from that, because it looks so, aromatic. Like it looks really, really good.
It is really, really good.
So next question says, we're so glad you came to Baltimore. What made you come in the first place?
So my husband is a Naval Academy grad, and we've both been infatuated with the DMV region. We could live anywhere. And I think that's part of why I was so wounded by some of the problems I had in the restoring of my house, because I don't have to live in Baltimore. We chose to live in Baltimore. I see great potential in Baltimore, but there are parts about it that are painful to watch, the disregard for humanity. And so we chose Baltimore because we had access to this historic house in Charles Village, and really became infatuated with the real estate. And there are parts of it that we really love. Roland Park reminds us of where we lived when we got married in Shaker Heights, and so we're hoping that we'll be able to make this our home.
I'm hoping so too. I am honored to have such a renowned person like yourself live in the same city. I feel like you're tangible. And I'm hoping that, this initial introduction to us too I'm hoping that we can connect, and, I can learn and pick your brain some more if you have the time, because I know you're very busy.
Well, I would love to do that. And I can't wait to come by the restaurant. I have not been in town a lot. And then there was COVID, right? So we couldn't get out. So we'll definitely connect.
Absolutely. So I think this may be our last question, but there may be more that comes through. So it says, what projects are you working on currently? This is a two-part question. Is it another book or another larger project?
So as I said earlier, I'm working on another book. I'm currently offline, as a matter of fact. So I have not been on social media since January. And I've only been doing a few public appearances that were, assigned later last year. The new book is part of a series of single subject books. So as I said, the Jemima Code was the book that was published to identify who the authors are in our history, who is important, and what cookbooks mattered. The follow-up is Jubilee, which is the recipes from the Jemima Code. Since everybody can't have full access to those cookbooks, I wanted you to be able to understand the trajectory of a dish over time. What is coming next is a Jubilee series. So there will be several books that will be single subject deep dives into a particular topic. And so the first one is cocktails.
Nice.
Even though I don't have expertise in cocktails, I'm doing a lot of studying and researching of fancy cocktails. But I wanted to be able to turn a spotlight on a lesser known profession within our community. People think of bartending in one way. They think about us in juke joints and bathtub gin and rent parties, but we don't stop to think about the competencies and the art associated with mixology. And there was actually in DC, there was a group in the 19th century called the Colored Mixologist Club. And these were Black men who pooled their resources and bought real estate. They advocated for each other and health concerns. They were involved in community uplift through their mixology practice or craft. So so the next book is on mixology, and then the follow-up is baking.
Awesome. That
Yeah.
is amazing. So that's so interesting because I was, thinking that, mixology was like this word that was newly created. You know how they try to make word, certain job descriptions like, sound better.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was like this new, and improved description to kind of elevate, the art of bartending. So that's interesting in and of itself to know that this was already an established identity. But another thing that I was thinking about, which I plan to ask you, is in your mixologist, series, do you intend to highlight, even those African Americans who even knew how to, create and make the spirits for the cocktails? When I think of, the Uncle Nearest brand and how, he learned to made whiskey and actually taught Jack Daniels how to make whiskey himself.
Yeah, I love your questions. Your journalism background certainly comes through. It's really an enjoyable conversation. Thank you. So yes, as a matter of fact, the book is broken down into chapters by the craft and the technique associated with making a mixed drink. So some of them are made in batches like punches. Some are shaken, some are stirred. We know that. But as an entry, just like in Jubilee, the essay that introduces each chapter will spotlight a particular craft, and whether they're distillers, moonshiners, cider makers. These are all people that had these are all African Americans that had that craft. There's a couple of people I've been actually hunting down, and I haven't had time to get into the library, but I plan to research. But there was a bartender in a hotel on a corner near Mount Vernon, and he filed a lawsuit for his freedom. Like there's bits and pieces of this story that I've been trying to assemble, but I do plan to the previous question, as soon as I get the framework for the book down, then looking through those details to personalize the regional influencers will be part of the work too.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I look forward to learning more about that. I didn't know that there was, this African American mixologist here in Mount Vernon that was, well known. So I look forward to experiencing that. So we do have another question.
Okay.
And it says, what's it been like being off social media during a pandemic? How has the pandemic affected your culinary research?
Well, the beauty of culinary research at this point is that so many resources are available online. And if you have a library card, you can access sources that you couldn't access outside it's not a paywall, but outside the walls of the library. Yeah. So I have been able to remotely research from a distance. Like if there are databases of Black newspapers. Right. There are all kinds of databases now that you can access on their own, or you can access them by going through your local library. And so I recommend that to my staff all of the time, especially when we were not able to go into the library at all. The inclination is to just go buy the books on Amazon or elsewhere, which is what I did and how I wound up getting my collection. But that's because those books were so rare that they were not available except in one or two locations around the country. But if you can access the databases now, it's kind of easy to do.
Awesome. So one last question. We're coming to an end, but it's been enjoyable and insightful and all of the things. So the last question says, what was working at Cook's Country like? Are the main people on PBS as personable as they seem?
I love my team. The team at America's Test Kitchen is just as much family as They appear to be, and I have been privileged to be embraced by that family. As I said, I'm here in Boston at our headquarters now because we're filming some special segments. So what happened was during the COVID, there's two people on camera. There's a host and then a cook, and they're bantering back and forth and talking about a recipe, and we couldn't do that during COVID. So everyone was cooking from home and talking to the camera instead of to a host.
Right.
And it created the opportunity for us to insert a segment from me into the show, which might have otherwise seemed a little bit arrogant or weird, that I would just be in the library by myself when everyone else was with somebody else. But the beauty of the pandemic is that my segment in the library, which we just love that title, in the library means that it's natural for me to be there with my books and my authors as my friends. It was a strange transition to go in front of the camera, to read the teleprompter, to be scripted, because I do that as a speaker, but it's a different kind of feedback and energy. And so we have some new plans for the show this year for Cook's Country. Again, we're going to be doing more storytelling and more attribution, giving even more history about recipes and where they come from, and how that's going to play into my library segment. We're doing this little test run to see how I cook on camera.
Awesome. Well, I think that is going to be phenomenal, and I look forward to seeing the new series and episodes.
Well, thank you very much. It's going to be fun. I've been rehearsing this afternoon, and I'm going to start tomorrow morning. So,
awesome. Well, best of luck.
Thank you so much. I chose a cookie as my kind of screen test, something that I was comfortable. Again, I take my own advice: get the skill, understand it, perfect it, and then go be creative with it. So I'm doing that same thing myself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Toni. It's been a pleasure speaking with you this evening, and I look forward to seeing all of your creative work in the future.
Well, it's been a delight to be with you. And as I said, you're a great interviewer and a great conversationalist. I've really enjoyed it and look forward to getting together outside of here.
Yes, likewise.
Yay. It's been a pleasure listening to you both talk this evening. I know that pound cake is going to haunt me too. I'm going to think about it and wake up in the middle of the night like I need to make it now. And I want to also thank our wonderful audience for joining us this evening as well, for all of your questions, all of your comments. Thank you, Toni, for coming to Baltimore. It's a pleasure to have you.
I'm happy to be here.
And I also want to thank the Hearing and Speech Agency for providing accessibility for tonight's program. For everyone out there, if you haven't already, please fill out the survey. We've posted it in the comments. It lets us know what kind of programming you'd like to see in the future. And with that, we're going to sign off for the evening. So stay safe, take care, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.